Today we're going to talk about a new type of equation called the quadratic equation. A quadratic equation has a power of 2 on the variable and has this form: ax squared plus bx plus c equal to 0. So that's the form of a quadratic equation where a, b, and c, they are real numbers. They are called the coefficients of the equation. A, b, and c are real numbers, and a, the lead coefficient a, is not equal to 0. Some examples of quadratic equations would be x squared minus 9x minus 22 equals 0. Quadratic equation. This one, x times 2x minus 7 equals 4. It's a quadratic equation. Why? Because when I multiply out this x, we will have an x squared in this equation. So let's take an example of how we solve these types of equations. And in order to solve these types of equations, we have to first discuss what's called the zero factor property. The zero factor property says if a and b are real numbers and a times b equals 0, so the product of these two numbers is 0, then either a must be 0 or b must be 0. So when you have the product of two factors or more and the result is 0, at least one of those factors must equal to 0. So we're going to use this property in solving quadratic equations. Here we have an example. It says solve this equation: x minus 3 times x plus 1 equals 0. Now you might be asking, well, is this a quadratic equation? It is, because if I were to FOIL this out, I would get an x squared in there. So this is a quadratic equation. And we have two factors. This equation has two factors. And according to the zero factor property, since the product of these two give me 0, each one of these can be 0. In other words, x minus 3 could be 0, and x plus 1 could also be 0. And so now I've reduced my quadratic equation to two linear equations. If I solve each of these equations separately, x minus 3 equals 0, it means that x is equal to 3. I add 3 to both sides. And x plus 1 equals 0 means that x is equal to negative 1. I subtract 1 from both sides. So I have two solutions: x equals 3, x equals negative 1. And notice if I put any one of these solutions back into my equation, if I put 3 in here, that makes this 0, which makes the whole thing 0. If I put negative 1 in here, that makes this factor 0, which makes the whole thing 0. So we have two solutions to this quadratic equation. Let's look at another example. This example asks us to solve this equation: x squared minus 9x minus 22 equals 0. So we don't have factors here, so we can't use the zero factor property yet. But this is a trinomial, and we would have learned how to factor trinomials. We can actually factor this. And how do we factor this? You may recall that to factor a trinomial, you put two sets of parentheses. And the first thing is you look at factors of this initial term, factors of x squared, will be x. And then you look at factors of 22. When you subtract them or add them, give you 9. In this case, we're subtracting because we want a negative 22. So to mind, the initial factors of 22 are 11 and 2. Those two factors come to mind. And then we have to figure out, well, what sign to put on them. We want a negative 9 in the middle. And so when we FOIL this back, we want to have an 11x and a 2x combined to give me negative 9. So you think about that a little. The 11 would have to be negative, because we're going to have a negative 11x. And the 2 would have to be positive. So this factors into 11 x minus 11 times x plus 2 equals 0. Just like the previous problem, now we have two factors. When multiplied, give us 0. Therefore, x minus 11 equals 0, or x plus 2 equals 0. Now we have two linear equations to solve. If we solve this one, we get x equal to 11. And if we solve the bottom one, x plus 2 equals 0, subtract 2 from both sides, we get x equals to negative 2. So there are our two solutions. And you should always check your solutions back in your equation. We got x equals 11 and x equals negative 2. If I plug 11 in back into my equation, I get 11 squared minus 9 times 11 minus 22. That gives me 121 minus 99 minus 22, and that works out to be 0. So that's a solution because we want it to equal 0. Similarly here we have negative 2 squared minus 9 times negative 2 minus 22. That gives me 4. Negative 9 times minus 2 is plus 18 minus 22. So that gives you 22 minus 22. 0 is your answer here, so that checks out as well. So those are our two answers. X equals negative 2 and x equals 11.